Okay, so we finished the chapter on psychology, and now we're doing a chapter on media. It should take about 40 to 45 minutes. Chapter 8. We have nothing to fear from institutional and media bias. The media holds a huge amount of influence over us, shaping our perceptions of certain topics by setting the agenda, deciding what is newsworthy, and influencing how we feel through the way stories are framed. In essence, bias from the media can create bias in society as well. This is important, as it's highly likely that you have seen reports about veganism in the news with headlines such as "Militant veganism is out of control," or "Farmers sent death threats by vegan activists." A good case in point occurred back in early 2018, when the BBC ran a piece about a farmer called Alison Wow, who said that she had received death threats and been sent notes from animal rights activists telling her and her family to go die. This caused a huge outcry, with national press coverage declaring that farmers were living in fear of vegans. I was subsequently invited onto the BBC to have a debate on live television with a dairy farmer about what they referred to as militant veganism and animal rights. Woe later stated that she had not had people making specific death threats towards me. Although this entirely contradicted her original statement, it had no effect on diminishing the narrative of frightened farmers living in fear of militant vegans, who were sending death threats. Nor did the BBC amend their original piece to reflect Woe's retraction. Furthermore, every time I have been invited to discuss the narrative of frightened farmers and militant vegans in the media, I have always raised the point that I have received threats from farmers, butchers, and meat eaters, yet the reaction to these threats I've received has never seemed as impassioned as the reaction that farmers get. Interestingly, I am always asked, "Do you denounce vegans sending death threats?" I think my interviewers secretly hope that I will say no. However, I bet they've never been asked to denounce meat eaters sending death threats to vegans. For example, Jude Kappa, the founder of the pro-dairy campaign February, set up to counteract Veganuary, was also involved in the BBC debate, and was actively perpetuating the "vegans sending farmers death threats" narrative. However, during this time, Jude also liked a tweet talking about shooting vegans that said, "Just load both barrels, but if you do shoot any vegans, remember to dispose of their bodies in an environmentally friendly manner." Of course, it's unlikely there was any real intention behind the tweets, but just imagine what the response would have been if the co-founders of Veganuary had liked a jokey tweet about shooting farmers. It is clear, then, that the media latched onto this particular story, not because they were outraged about the threats per se. Unfortunately, most outspoken people on social media have received threats in one form or another, but because it played into a deeper narrative, the portrayal of veganism and animal rights as being militant, problematic, and dangerous, something that exists outside of normalized society and poses a direct threat to its citizens and traditions. It's one of the oldest tricks in the book, the ad hominem attack of those who want to disrupt the status quo. Personal attacks are an effective way of avoiding debating the actual issues. If you can't argue against the message, you attack the messenger to try to muddy their public image and portray them in a way that puts people off. Merchants of doubt. A great example of just this sort of media bias was seen in the Daily Express in 2018, which ran the headline, "Vegan activists want farmers, children hurt as veggie politics get very dark." However, the article included no evidence to support that claim, and further assertions that vegans' strong viewpoints have led many to advocate the murder, rape, and torture of farmers and their families were provided with no supporting evidence either. Regardless of how baseless the claims were, this kind of messaging further reinforces the notion that outspoken vegans are a threat and something to be wary of. The media also often falsely claims that young women, the demographic currently most likely to go vegan, are making the change due to having orthorexia and other eating disorders that they want to disguise. This is further combined with reports about veganism being unhealthy, with the death of a climber on Everest becoming a global news story because she was vegan. Even though many non-vegans have died climbing Everest, and vegans have also climbed Everest and survived. More insidiously, veganism has been blamed for parents killing their children, with a story in 2007 exclaiming, "Vegan diet kills baby," even though the prosecutors in the case stated that the child died because he was not fed. The vegan diet is fine. The narrative became that the baby died because the parents were vegan, not because they starved the baby by not feeding him. Reports like this show a clear and emphatic bias. When babies of non-vegan parents die from malnourishment and starvation, they are never described as meat-eating killers. Nor is the fact that the parents eat meat, dairy, and eggs described as a reason for the baby dying. In 2020, I came across an article with the headline, "Screaming baby starved to death surrounded by curdled milk as mother did nothing." Throughout the article, there was no mention that the baby's mother ate animal products. But there is no doubt that the article would have read very differently if the baby had been surrounded by curdled soy milk. These kinds of stories have a huge influence on people's perceptions of vegans, to the point where feeding certified Class 1 carcinogens, such as bacon, to children is seen as being an example of normal parenting, but a plant-based diet is seen as child abuse. In 2019, a report came out attempting to discredit the World Health Organization's advice to reduce processed and red meat consumption on the grounds of an increased risk of cancer and heart disease. The report was heavily criticized by public health researchers, including the American Heart Association, the American Cancer Society, and the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. It was also conducted by a research group that received funding from AgriLife, an organization that works with the Texas Beef Checkoff and includes a beef cattle teaching program, educational workshops for cattle ranchers, and promotion of Texas beef to consumers, further undermining its impartiality. However, this wasn't enough to stop Philip Schofield, one of the most popular presenters on British television, defiantly declaring on a live broadcast to millions of people that bacon is back on the menu, and the bottom line is, when you read this stuff, the studies linking processed and red meat to cancer and heart disease, just think, I can't be bothered. Don't take any notice of them because they all change it. This statement was delivered to the British public as heart disease continues to be the #1 killer of people worldwide, and colon cancer continues to be the second most deadly cancer in the UK, with only lung cancer killing more people each year. Unfortunately, examples like this don't just turn people away from veganism, they potentially compromise people's health and lives. I came face to face with Philip Schofield when I appeared on This Morning in late 2018 to discuss militant veganism with him, his co-host Rochelle Humes, and the journalist Julie Bindel, who was appearing as a guest alongside me, in a segment very subtly called "Are Militant Vegans Going Too Far?" Even though I had expected that I would be asked to denounce death threats, the lengths that the show went to try to get me to say something that would insinuate that I have nefarious intentions was surprising, and it wasn't until after the interview that I realized how significantly Philip had tried to goad me into a reaction. Philip: Are you militant? Me: Militant is an interesting word. I stand up for what I believe in, and I speak it, and I preach it, and I do it hopefully in a way that I believe to be effective. Philip: How far will you go? Me: How far will I go? I mean, that sounds like a loaded question. Philip: Well, it is a loaded question. Me: Exactly. Philip: Because obviously we're going to talk about the militant vegans. Me: Yeah? Philip: And so when I use that word, you say you don't really like it, but who will take it to the extreme? Who will be violent? Who will be offensive? Who will be, frankly, quite frightening? Me: Right. So violence, of course, is never on the table. We don't condone violence in any way, shape, or form. Offense is a very unique thing. It's very subjective. I'm personally offended by people who exploit animals. However, my offense about it isn't necessarily a good enough justification for them to stop. So we have to not be so concerned about offense, but concerned about justice and what's happening to animals. Then there was the comment about eating a sausage. Philip: I mean, I'm one of those people that I'll listen to any argument, but the more militant you are, the more likely I'll back away from you. Rochelle: Totally. Philip: So if you make me that angry, if you frighten me that much, I will eat the sausage. All except me, laughter. I couldn't help but wonder how Philip would react if someone said that the protesting against the killing of dogs in Asia made them want to go and eat a dog. It's important to say, however obvious this is, that any violent threats, whether from vegans or not, are detestable and always wrong. It does, though, speak to the point I was making earlier. Throughout the whole segment, I was repeatedly asked how far I was willing to go, and whether I agreed with meat eaters being sent death threats, accompanied by audible sighs of disgust at the threats vegans had been accused of sending. But Julie Bindel wasn't at any point asked if she condoned the threats that I, or any other vegan, have been sent. Seeing through the facade. It's important for us to recognize how much power the media and advertising have in terms of their ability to influence us as consumers, especially as they don't always promote products that are beneficial for us. After all, it wasn't that long ago that there were adverts with doctors recommending cigarettes. The links between smoking and cancer had already been established. They were just not universally believed at that time, and had not taken hold in a society that was reluctant to believe that smoking was dangerous, partly because it was so prevalent and normalized, and partly because we had been told it was healthy. Sound familiar? A similar thing is being documented happening with regards to climate change, with the fossil fuel lobby following in the footsteps of the tobacco industry, and funding scientists and PR companies in an attempt to create doubt about the link between emissions and the climate crisis. And the same tactic of disseminating doubt is being used by the meat, dairy, and egg industries as well. And to such good effect that one of Britain's best-known TV presenters actually stated live on air that he just didn't believe the information that's coming out challenging our current consumption habits. In fact, the lead researcher behind the aforementioned industry-funded study that spurred Philip Schofield to exclaim, "Bacon is back on the menu," was awarded the 2020 Distinguished Research Award from an industry group called the American Meat Science Association, AMSA, an organization that discovers, develops, and disseminates its collective meat science knowledge. We are constantly bombarded with adverts on TV promoting happy animals and animal products. When was the last time you saw an advert promoting vegetables or fruit? When was the last time you saw an advert promoting meat, dairy, or eggs? We walk into supermarkets and we see adverts with statements such as, "Happy cows produce happy milk," or "We only source meat from high welfare farms." There is even a brand called Happy Eggs, which, when I used to eat eggs, was the one I would always buy because I believed that the name meant that they must treat their hens with compassion. But when you consider what actually happens to egg-laying hens, it's nothing short of outrageous that a brand can call their eggs happy. 3 farms, all RSPCA assured, that produce eggs for the Happy Egg Company were exposed by an investigation in early 2021, which documented dead and decomposing birds and birds with bloody wounds and open sores. In response, a spokesperson for Noble Foods, who owned the Happy Egg brand, said, "Nothing is more important to us than the safe and proper care of our hens." This is completely at odds with the fact that the hens had been de-beaked, had open wounds, and were all going to be killed at a slaughterhouse when they were no longer profitable. In reality, an egg-laying farm is arguably the least safe place a chicken could have the misfortune of finding themselves. This sort of rhetoric from the animal farming industries is relentless. They simultaneously complain that clearly labeled packaging for plant-based foods is misleading, and then claim that animal safety is their main priority, even when there is irrefutable video evidence that this is simply not the case. This constant repetition of statements, like the one from Noble Foods, plays into a concept called the illusory truth effect, which refers to the notion that when we consistently hear statements or ideas being repeated, we perceive them as being more truthful than new statements, even if they are not. Over and over, we hear the same thing from these industries. Farmers love their animals and always make their well-being a priority. We have the best standards in the world. Meat, dairy, and eggs are important for a balanced diet. And the list goes on. And every time we hear these statements, or go into a supermarket and see a picture of a smiling farmer in a field with a statement about what a lovely life the animals are allowed to have, it becomes easier and easier for us to believe that it is true. The advertisement of meat, eggs, and dairy also directly ties into many of the ideas that were discussed in the previous chapter, as it can help perpetuate many of the prevailing attitudes that encourage us to continue consuming animal products. Presenting us with images of happy, smiling animals, such as laughing cow spreadable cheese, promotes the idea that they are willing participants in their exploitation and death. It immediately eases our conscience, as we presume that the products come from a happy animal, as I did with the eggs. In addition, some packaging depicts green pastures and farmyard buildings that evoke romanticized ideals of farming. Some brands and supermarkets have even created fake farm names, such as Tesco's Woodside Farms and Lidl's Birchwood Farm. By doing this, supermarkets are subtly influencing our perception of the products and creating the impression of transparency and traceability, as well as conjuring up this sentimentalized idea of farming. And yet, these entirely fictitious farms actually further emphasize how untrustworthy and misleading animal product marketing really is. However, while these are examples of disingenuous labeling and promotion, the way that companies market to children is downright immoral. There is, of course, no better example than McDonald's so-called Happy Meal, a product aimed at kids that uses toys and movie tie-ins to incentivize parents to buy it for their children. In reality, it's a box filled with processed cheese and processed meat, a Class 1 carcinogen and full of cholesterol, saturated fat, and salt, that came from an animal who had their throat cut in a slaughterhouse. Yet all of this is conveniently ignored and is instead packaged in a kid-friendly way. The vegan chicken Kiev. One of my favorite foods before I went vegan was a chicken Kiev. When I became vegan, I had to accept that I would probably never eat one again. I thought that if there ever was a vegan chicken Kiev produced, that would be a sign of how much things were changing. In fact, when I first went vegan, just the thought of being able to get vegan cheese at a regular supermarket seemed crazy. If I wanted to get vegan alternatives, I had to go to a niche organic store, which were few and far between. And even then, the selection of vegan options could be lackluster, to say the least. In the space of just a few years, everything has changed. Not only are vegan alternatives found everywhere, but their sales are increasing exponentially as well. Between 2018 and 2020, there was a 49% growth in the volume of plant-based foods being consumed in the EU. And in the USA, sales rose by 27% in 2020 alone. I'm pleased to say that there are even several different brands now making vegan chicken Kievs, which taste exactly the same as the ones I used to eat, but without any chickens having to be killed. However, the rise of plant-based foods hasn't been viewed positively by everyone, and has led to a pushback from the animal exploitation industries, which are focused on challenging the labeling of plant-based alternatives. The aforementioned bias in food marketing is even more egregious when you consider that in the EU, plant-based food companies can't call their plant milks milk because it's deemed as being confusing and misleading to the consumer. It was even debated by the EU whether plant-based foods could be called burgers or sausages. Thankfully, the so-called burger ban wasn't passed, but it seems peculiar that a packet of meat-free burgers would be seen as potentially confusing, whereas a carton of happy eggs is perfectly acceptable. Unbelievably, the burger ban isn't even the most extreme example of censorship of plant-based products that the EU has attempted. Amendment 171, which the European Commission initially voted in favour of in late 2020, before it was then rejected by the European Parliament 7 months later, was an attempt to go even further, making it illegal for plant-based foods to describe their products in a manner that uses familiar dairy terminology. For example, it's like milk, creamy, and buttery, or even to those more directly informative descriptions such as does not contain milk and plant-based alternative to yogurt, as they still contain the words milk and yogurt. More concerning still, plant-based companies may have not been allowed to make comparisons between the environmental impact of their products versus dairy products, advertise their products in a way that could be interpreted as being visually similar to a dairy product, such as showing a white foam swirling into a coffee, or use typical dairy packaging, such as yogurt pots. And the reason for all this? Because it's confusing to consumers, who are apparently too uneducated and gullible to understand that something labelled as a plant-based alternative is indeed just that. Which leads me to wonder when the EU is going to ban hot dogs for not actually containing dogs, fish fingers for not containing fingers, and hamburgers for not containing ham, which should be called pig flesh anyway. And what about peanut butter and coconut milk? How is it that these two items have not caused the kind of consumer confusion that the EU members who voted in favour of Amendment 171 claim they were trying to protect their constituents from? How many times have you bought a tin of coconut milk to then get home and be dismayed to find out that it isn't cow's milk, but actually coconut milk? Never? And yet the EU wants us to believe that this is what is happening with customers when they are buying oat milk. Call me cynical, but it seems as if consumer confusion wasn't really the main motivation behind proposed legislation, such as Amendment 171. This becomes increasingly apparent when viewed alongside a study published in late 2020 that was the first of its kind to explore whether or not plant-based companies using words like milk and meat was actually causing confusion to consumers. The research discovered that consumers are not more likely to think that plant-based products are in fact animal products, and that actually stopping plant-based companies from being able to use these words causes more confusion, as the consumers don't know what taste the plant-based products are supposed to replicate or how they should be used. This sort of thing is not just happening in the EU. In the USA, a large number of states, including Missouri, Mississippi, Montana, South Dakota, Wyoming, Texas, Oklahoma, Nebraska, Iowa, Colorado, and Louisiana, among others, have also attempted to implement similar bans on plant-based food and cell-cultured meat labeling. Interestingly, 7 of the 10 biggest cattle farming states appear on that list, which is perhaps not surprising when the National Cattlemen's Beef Association's top policy priority in 2019 was addressing false and deceptive marketing. And they created a petition calling on the word meat to be used only for animals farmed in the traditional manner. This is ironic, coming from an industry that uses selective breeding, artificial insemination, and genetically modified crops, not to mention growth promoters, hormones, and antibiotics to maximize their profits. It's also worth mentioning that many of these states would classify themselves as having a small government approach to politics, a phrase that signifies upholding libertarian values of limited government intervention, especially in terms of public policy and private sector regulation. Except, of course, the very opposite is true when it comes to their involvement in censoring the plant-based sector. Obviously, one of the primary reasons for this comes down to the relationship that the agricultural sector has with government, and there's no better example of this than the dairy industry. Fast food and hit jobs. In 1983, the US dairy industry lobbied Congress to allow them to create the National Dairy Checkoff, also known as the Dairy Promotion Program, a scheme where dairy farmers pay into a pot of money that, among other things, is then used for promotional campaigns to encourage consumers to buy more dairy products. However, while the program is funded by dairy farmers, the federal government oversees, evaluates, and approves almost every aspect of it. With United States Department of Agriculture, USDA, employees attending checkoff meetings. The USDA is also the government organization that writes nutritional guidelines in the USA. This is especially concerning, as it means that they are not only responsible for the creation of adverts promoting dairy consumption, but they also advise people on how much dairy to consume in the first place, which could possibly explain why the USDA still recommends adults consume 3 servings of dairy a day, while the Canadian Ideal Food Plate has removed dairy as a food group altogether. And even though it is still listed as a protein source, there are no recommendations for how much to consume, or that you even need to consume it at all. To make matters worse, Dairy Management Inc., DMI, which is funded by the USDA-managed Dairy Checkoff Program, works with schools and fast food chains to increase overall dairy consumption. For example, DMI has worked with McDonald's to increase the size of cheddar cheese slices by more than 30% in some of their items, and with Pizza Hut to add 25% more cheese to their pan pizza. They also created a pizza with Domino's that contained as much as 2/3 of a day's maximum recommended amount of saturated fat. So, the government department that creates the nutritional guidelines and advises people how to eat healthy also works with the farming industries to promote their products and get more of them sold in fast food chains and restaurants. It's not just the USDA's involvement in the dairy checkoff program that is alarming. In 2014, US company Hampton Creek, now called Just, was generating a significant amount of interest in their plant-based egg and mayonnaise substitutes. This concerned the American Egg Board, AEB, a US government-appointed agricultural body that, as shown in emails acquired through a Freedom of Information request, viewed Hampton Creek as being a major threat. Consequently, they launched a concerted effort to attack the company, including trying to get the supermarket chain Whole Foods to stop selling their products and advertising Unilever, who produce Hellmann's mayonnaise, on how to build a lawsuit against Hampton Creek for false advertising. One of the heads of the USDA also joined the attack on Hampton Creek and suggested that the AEB should contact the Government Food and Drug Administration, FDA, to see if they could help with their concerns. And if that wasn't shady enough, the Freedom of Information obtained emails revealing that the head of the AEB was involved in a conversation where an executive vice president of the AEB member organization said in reference to Hampton Creek CEO Josh Tetrick, "Can we pull our money and put a hit on him?" There was even an email from the executive vice president of AEB offering to contact some of my old buddies in Brooklyn to pay Mr. Tetrick a visit. These disturbing emails and the potential that the AEB had used funds illegally in the Anti-Hampton Creek campaign were placed under investigation. However, it was led by the USDA, the same government department that had appointed the members of the AEB and that was itself implicated by the allegations. Perhaps unsurprisingly then, they found no criminal wrongdoing and decided that the emails were sent in jest. I wonder if the USDA would have felt the same if the tables had been turned and Hampton Creek executives had been sending emails about paying for hits on members of USDA-appointed agency employees. Meat industry lobbying further contributes to the problem of government and industry collusion, with 10 of the biggest meat companies in the USA spending $26 million in the past 20 years alone on political campaigns, and over $100 million on lobbying in general. When the amount spent on lobbying is viewed as a percentage of the company's overall revenue, Tyson has spent double what oil company Exxon has spent on political campaigns. They were also revealed to be funding organizations that actively worked to minimize the connection between animal farming and climate change. This industry and government collaboration isn't a uniquely American situation, though. In the UK, during the COVID-19 pandemic, the Department for the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, DERFA, spent £500,000 of taxpayers' money on a promotional campaign for the dairy industry. This at a time when charities were struggling to provide food to the most vulnerable people and the NHS was overwhelmed. DERFA spent more than double what the Agriculture and Horticulture Development Board, AHDB, spent on their campaign, even though one of the primary functions of the AHDB is to fund promotional campaigns on behalf of the farmers who pay the levy. Imagine the uproar if the UK government funded advertising campaigns for plant-based products and tried to get people to drink oat milk. The AHDB also co-developed the UK's National Dietary Guidelines alongside Public Health England. Y is a lobby group that is funded by farmers and exists to best serve their interests, also a co-developer of our nutritional guidelines. The AHDB are also a sustaining member, meaning they donate regularly, of the British Nutrition Association, who are another organization involved in the creation of government dietary guidelines. Back in 2019, Michael Gove, who was at that time the minister in charge of DERFA, also said at the National Farmers Union conference that dairy farmers deserve protection from activists who would undermine their work, and that he was an enthusiastic supporter of the February campaign, the one founded by the person who liked a tweet about shooting vegans. Imagine what the reaction would be if the head of DERFA stated that they were an enthusiastic supporter of veganuary. But why do dairy farmers deserve public support, but oat farmers who support oat milk don't? Soy boys and fragile masculinity. Of course, media and advertising campaigns aren't just about promoting the consumption of animal products, but are also significant factors in shaping our perception of meat eating. For example, there is a very prevalent idea that to be a real man, you have to eat animal flesh, and that by going vegan, you are somehow emasculating yourself. This is something that I have encountered firsthand, with people calling me a soy boy for being vegan. So where does this idea come from? In some ways, it can be traced back to our nomadic roots, when it was generally thought that the men hunted and the women gathered. However, there is evidence of those roles in fact being less gender divided within some hunter-gatherer communities. That said, if we try to excuse men eating meat by saying it's because they used to be hunters, we're misunderstanding our ancestors, as for them the act of killing an animal wasn't the point, it was an act of provision. The fact that men hunted was secondary to the fact that hunting ensured communities could survive. If the idea is that eating meat is manly because men used to be hunters, then really the conclusion should be that providing for your community and looking after those around you is what makes you a man. In those terms, the idea that meat eating is masculine is farcical, as the modern-day consumption of meat negatively impacts those around us, whether by increasing the risk of pandemics or being a significant contributor to the climate crisis. Plus, it's much too simplistic to point to our nomadic days to justify our behavior thousands of years later. The truth is that this attitude about masculinity and meat eating is more closely linked to how animal products are marketed and advertised. For instance, companies will often heavily sexualize the marketing of meat products, with campaigns from companies such as Carl's Jr., Burger King, Subway, and many more using imagery of women to sell their products to a male audience. Alternatively, meat companies will depict animal products as being eaten by men, with taglines such as "Feed the Man" being used to promote Ginster's products, or "Man Up" in an advert promoting a new Carl's Jr. burger. There was also Burger King's Eat Like a Man commercial, in which a guy sang about not wanting to eat chick food, and the Guys Love Bacon campaign from Taco Bell. These companies have for decades reinforced the message that red meat in particular is what men eat, so it's no wonder that this idea has become so prevalent throughout our society. All of this advertising has led to some interesting social science though. For example, a study from the University of Hawaii found that men routinely incorporate more red meat into their diet to reassure themselves that when they feel that their masculinity is under threat. And there can be no better demonstration of this than when Fox News host Jesse Walters ate a steak alive on television in front of a social psychologist who had come on to discuss the perceived link between eating meat and masculinity. In what can only be described as an astounding display of irony, Waters genuinely thought that he was hilariously dismissing her work while actually validating the very point she was making. Some men who feel the need to assert their masculinity, or who feel their masculinity is being threatened, will use red meat as a means to make themselves feel more manly. Another reason for this perceived relationship between meat and masculinity is the fact that meat is seen as a power symbol and a sign of prosperity and wealth. Our level of meat consumption in the West has only been this high for a very short period of time, coinciding with a significant period of societal progression and advancement. Consequently, we perceive unrestrained meat consumption as being a product of social modernity and symbolizing the end of food scarcity and rationing, which was the paradigm in the early 20th century before the rise of industrial agriculture and intensive animal farming. This idea of meat being viewed as a power symbol was shown in a paper published in the journal Appetite. The researchers collected a group of participants from a range of backgrounds and found that those who were lower on the economic scale had a greater preference for meat than those higher up it. The researchers concluded that this was likely because people see meat as substitutable for status. So wanting to eat meat was a reflection of how the participants felt about their own circumstances in life. Studies such as this one, also provide interesting explanations as to why fast food chains, which have been shown to be 5 times more prevalent in lower income areas of many cities in the UK, are often the same companies that most heavily perpetuate the idea of meat being a male status symbol. A huge issue with this mindset is that it can dissuade men who want to stop eating meat from doing so. A piece of research presented at the Royal Geographical Society showed that men find it difficult to choose the vegan option when in public with other men, and that those who reduced their intake of animal protein even reported experiencing social isolation among their male friends. The researchers stated that the men perceived the need for social permission to choose a meat-free option. There is, however, an obvious irony in the fact that meat is supposedly seen as a sign of strength and status, but is being eaten because some men are too afraid to make a change in front of other men. This point highlights the wider fallacy of the perceived link between meat and masculinity. Those who say they eat meat because it makes them manly are the ones who are most conscious about their masculinity in the first place. If men were truly comfortable with their masculinity, they wouldn't feel the need to prove anything to anyone. In the same way that meat was used as a substitute for a perceived lack of status, the same must also be true for masculinity. We've talked about how social pressure heavily influences our decision-making. So, combining social pressure with a man's fear of his masculinity being questioned creates an incredibly challenging prospect for men who might want to become vegan. The idea that men in these situations are so susceptible to social conformity or pressure might seem hyperbolic. However, the famous Milgram experiment further emphasizes just how challenging the act of going against what you are being told by those around you can be. In 1963, Stanley Milgram carried out a study to explore the relationship between obedience to authority and personal conscience. He demonstrated that the participants in the experiment were willing to administer increasingly strong electric shocks to a knowing participant in the study. The shocks were in fact fake. Milgram explained this behavior by concluding that in certain situations, people can sometimes enter what is known as the agent state, where they allow other people to direct their actions and try to pass off any responsibility for these actions by blaming the person who they are obeying. Although Milgram's experiment was more specifically about the effect of authority figures, in an attempt to explain how people who worked in concentration camps were able to carry out their orders, a related dynamic can play out in social situations. Men encounter increasing pressure from their peers if they seem to want to choose a plant-based option, to the point where it becomes easier for the person to choose the meat option, but psychologically distance themselves from the responsibility of the action by blaming it on the person who is making them obedient. This phenomenon is something that meat dairy and egg advertisers are very much aware of and use in their campaigns, with adverts such as the aforementioned Burger King's Eat Like a Man advert, featuring hundreds of men singing "I am a man" as they talk about eating a beef burger, which not only creates a fabricated sense of peer pressure from hundreds of fictional male characters, but creates a false idea of gendered foods through the use of imperative and authoritative language. Wave tofu bye-bye, now it's the wafer beef I reach, I will eat this meat. Often without us realizing, our preconceptions about different foods and what they symbolize are dictated by a variety of external factors. In the case of men, the narrative around red meat and masculinity has been molded through decades of advertising that attempts to reinforce this idea, although in reality it's not substantiated by anything meaningful or relevant. A very inconvenient truth. It is incredibly frustrating how underreported the impact of animal agriculture is, and it's certainly not down to a lack of studies to report on. It can feel like an uphill battle trying to raise awareness about these issues when they are so often ignored by the media, or when the media instead pushes sensationalist stories, such as the vegan dying while climbing Everest. I find myself having to regularly deal with arguments that people have read online and haven't properly researched themselves, whether it's that tofu is destroying the Amazon and is filled with estrogen, or that vegans are actually responsible for killing more animals. And did I mention that a vegan died climbing Everest? Perhaps even more frustrating is how readily information about the impact of animal farming is disregarded by people as being propaganda, probably because they don't see it being discussed enough in the media. But this is nothing new. Broader coverage of the consequences of animal farming has historically been very infrequent, with one study that looked at 16 leading US newspapers from 2005 to 2008, identifying 4,500 articles about climate change, but only 2.4% of those mentioning the contribution of animal agriculture to the crisis. Another study that looked at coverage from 2006 to 2018 in 4 major media organizations, 2 in the UK and 2 in the USA, discovered that only 4% of the 114,000 articles that mentioned climate change also mentioned animal agriculture. This lack of coverage was in spite of the fact that the UN's landmark report on animal farming and the environment, called Livestock's Long Shadow, was released in 2006. The report outlined the need to acknowledge animal farming as a major contributor to the climate crisis. But, as these studies show, that didn't happen. This in turn had an impact on public opinion, with a 2020 government survey on members of the UK public showing that only 22% of people perceived agriculture as contributing a great deal to the climate crisis. A huge part of the problem is that the animal agriculture industries perpetuate misinformation and create confusion in the eyes of the consumer. A 2021 investigation into 10 of the biggest meat industry organizations in the world, which analyzed hundreds of documents and statements by the companies, revealed that the meat industry is copying what the tobacco industry used to do and the fossil fuel industry continues to do: create confusion and doubt. They were shown to be attempting to downplay the impact that animal products have on the environment, or questioning the efficacy of plant-based diets, often by funding their own studies that they then give to the press via their PR teams. They were also shown to be creating their own sustainability labels and guidelines to greenwash their products. The report also criticized the media's role in presenting many of the meat industry's fallacies without scrutinizing them, stating that journalists were struggling to mediate the discussion between the meat industry PR and the scientific literature on the impact of animal farming. A Harvard Law School policy fellow stated, "If you have virtual consensus on one side, and a few people over here, many of whom receive funding from the meat industry, that should be reported. It shouldn't be seen as two equal interlocutors presenting equally valid opposing opinions." That being said, in the past several years, it seems as if things have been slowly changing, especially in the advertising space, where there have been an increasing number of adverts promoting plant-based alternatives, although these adverts normally promote a very abrupt reaction from the animal farming industries. Case in point, an advert from Tesco promoting meatless sausages caused an uproar from the farming community. It featured a young girl coming home from school and telling her father, "Daddy, I don't want to eat animals anymore." To which the father tells the viewers, "I bloomin' love my meat, but not as much as I love my little girl." The National Farmers Union responded by attacking the advert for demonizing meat as a food group and said that it had caused significant distress for British farmers. Rather farcically, the NFU even criticized the BBC for a promotional Christmas advert, where in one scene an animated cartoon turkey is depicted wearing a knitted jumper that says "I love vegans" on it. The vice president of the union said it showed an agenda against livestock farming. Although responses such as these might seem ludicrous, the animal farming community is actually being deadly serious. For years, meat, dairy, and egg companies have monopolized the advertising space, creating narratives and ideas about animal consumption and perpetuating preconceptions in order to continue selling their products. This is ultimately why they react with such hostility to plant-based advertising and anything that contradicts the narrative they have dominated for decades. After all, they know how powerful advertising can be, and for the first time, they are beginning to see it being used to disrupt their industries. Believing the facts. Ultimately, the changing landscape of the advertising world and of consumer attitudes shows that while there has been historical media and institutional bias in protecting the interests of animal agriculture, that bias hasn't been able to stop the gradual shifts that are occurring. Previous generations didn't have access to the information that is available to us today. We are now able to look at both sides of the debate and apply some important scrutiny to the information that we had little choice but to take at face value in the past. For too long, meat industry boards, lobby groups, and industry-funded PR campaigns have dominated the narrative, but the facade of animal farming is slowly beginning to crumble. The world's most renowned and highly regarded scientific organizations and institutions are repeatedly warning us about the dangers, both global and individual, of animal farming. And the reality of what animals are forced to endure is becoming not only better understood, but increasingly harder to ignore. Importantly, issues that were once rarely, if ever, discussed are becoming a more familiar part of the conversation. As consumers, we are now able to see how biases are being perpetuated and how they are meant to drive our behaviors and attitudes. Because of this, we can empower ourselves, and indeed each other, to instead make informed decisions with a broader understanding of what the reality of animal farming and the damage it causes actually is. The American author Seth Godin once said, "Facts are irrelevant. What matters is what the consumer believes." This is the philosophy the animal agriculture industries have relied on for decades, tricking consumers into believing things that are simply not true. However, consumers are now beginning to believe the facts, and for animal agriculture, nothing could be worse. Alright, that's the end of the chapter on media and institutional bias, so I'll hop into the voice chat to discuss it for a few minutes. And next week, at the same time, we're going to finish off the book. We've got the last chapter on talking about veganism, and then there's one on a vegan and an afterword on like a vegan world would be better for everyone. All right, hello. What do we think of that chapter? Yep. I liked a lot of what it said. Hang on, let me take a look over it again. I especially like the section where anyone saying soy boy or thinking like eating meat makes you manly, that has always reeked to me of like huge insecurity, like really, really fragile masculinity. The only people who I think are concerned about their own masculinity are people who are, insecure about it. And they're desperately trying to prove something. They're trying to get recognition as a man or whatever. And in this case, they can feel pressured by advertising into handing over their money so that, if you give me money, you'll be more of a man. And it works. Isn't that... That's ridiculous. But yeah, even one of my old employers called me soy boy. So yeah, it's hectic. I thought it was really weird that there's no evidence that's ever been produced of like vegans sending death threats to farmers, or if it happens, it's so weird that they're refusing to produce that evidence, right? But the co-founder of Febudairy and the head of the American the something egg thing, the Egg Council or whatever, were joking about having vegans killed. And it's interesting that this is also the case in Ibram Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. When a meat eater does something wrong, that says nothing about meat eaters. But when a vegan does something wrong, well, suddenly that's reflective of the whole group. Vegans are all ambassadors for all vegans. Yeah. It's interesting. So people will feel more attached to meat if they feel like they're being forced to not eat meat. So it's really bizarre that there is so much social conformity and advertising and pressure and just an unbelievable amount of government and industry funding going towards this stuff. And they're influencing nutritional guidelines and all this kind of stuff. Yet they feel like they're being forced to eat less meat. And so they're doubling down on meat. It's hysterical. It's ridiculous. Yeah. I wish people had that sense of resisting force, but if they could recognize it in the case of animal products. Because there's a whole, like, pretty much every power in society is pushing for that, but they feel like they're not being forced to eat that. I like the thing about merchants of doubt. I think that's absolutely true. They try to sow any doubt. If you can just give people a little bit of doubt, they'll just do whatever they want, So if you make them think that processed meat won't give their kids cancer, then they'll be, well, fine. I guess it's disagreement. I'm going to feed my kid the class 1 carcinogen because the meat council said it should be fine.
The meat council.
Yeah, the meat council. That's literally what happened. And also the meat industry funding studies. That's interesting as well. Is that any industry funded study should just be excluded. They're like because they're not the academics they hire know that their customer is looking for a particular outcome, and they're not going to hire you, or if you give them the wrong outcome. And they don't have to publish any study. They could repeat a study 10 times and publish the one that shows the one their customer likes. Or they could just focus on aspects that are more charitable to the industry and completely ignore aspects that are not favorable to industry. And they could, and any aspect that might be favorable to industry, they can repeat that study 50 times and then look, all of these papers support industry. Yeah. There was also a study on vegaphobia in UK newspapers where I think it said vegans were described incredibly negatively 75% of the time, neutrally 20% of the time, and positively 5% of the time, which is a net negative of 70%. I don't think any other group would be described. Maybe terror, maybe, like ISIS. I wonder which other group has that net negative. And it said that vegans are described as aesthetic, fanatical, sentimentalists, violent, completely impractical, all this kind of stuff. Unhealthy, of course.
It's rich that they use like violent.
Yeah, I was surprised that Ed didn't mention that. It's like, do you condemn violence? Like, yes, that's literally the entire point. Well done.
Yeah.
Do you? A meat eater asking me if I condemn violence. It's hilarious.
Yeah.
But yeah. Alright, if no one else has anything else to say. Oh, I'll just add that, so there was the research on how people who are attached to meat actively avoid any information about the intelligence of animals they eat. Like, they won't avoid information about how intelligent dogs are. They will actively avoid information about how intelligent pigs are, the more attached they are to meat. Also, eating meat is, there's different aspects to Carnism. And so there was a really famous paper measuring Carnism as an ideology, where they basically verified it. And it is heavily linked with a justification for inequality, violence, and dominance. And it directly translates to higher support for racism and sexism. And in other studies, seeing animals as very distant from humans, if you stimulate that perception, then people become way more nativist as well. So they have much less empathy for immigrants and all this kind of stuff. There was another one where I think he might have mentioned it earlier in the book, where if you get people to snack on nuts, then they'll be like, oh yeah, obviously animals are, farmed animals are intelligent and they suffer when they're confined and all that kind of stuff. But if you give them meat to snack on, like jerky, then they'll be like, oh, obviously cows are dumb and pigs are dumb and they don't suffer and it's all fine. So people's beliefs are so hijacked by what they want to do. And that's interesting.
It's like a... Yeah.
Yeah. Another study, so talking about the gender side, is if you make what I think they called it the animal connection. So if you talk about how a lamb was raised and maybe how they suffered and what they experienced and all that kind of stuff to an audience, the women become less attached to meat and less likely to eat lamb. The men become more attached to meat and more likely to eat lamb. And so there's a kind of F you, I'm doubling down. I hope that, the little lamb suffers and dies or whatever. It's really, really disturbing the way men respond to this stuff. Not only do they feel really fragile about their masculinity and social approval and all this kind of stuff, and they also, they respond by doubling down. As a group, like obviously, I think when you correct for universalism, that goes away. So, men with a value high of universal consideration are no less likely to go vegetarian than women with the high value of universalism. So that's interesting as well. But men tend to have much lower value for universalism. Yeah, it's all really interesting stuff. Alright, I'm going to end the conversation here, and next week we'll finish the book, and then I guess we'll vote on another one. Hopefully with shorter chapters, so it's less of an ordeal. Yeah.
Thanks for the readout.
That's alright.
Yeah, thanks so much.
See ya.
All right,